it away. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So I am Martinet Lee. So today I'm going to talk about what is an audit. So it's more of a beginner session. I'll throw in here bits and tips for like developers as well. But most of all, it's like audits 101 and clarifying some misconceptions. So let's go. So a bit of background for myself, Martinet, and then I'm head of developer relations at QuantStamp. My experience, I actually start as a security auditor. So I have audited, well, more than 50 projects from DeFi, NFT to layer ones. Some stuff you might have heard of, including Yearn, ETH itself, so prison implementation, and then Avalanche as well. Our firm did a lot more other stuff. Then I continue to serve as audit PM, standardizing a lot of like different stuff. So kind of like all stack on the auditing side. And so today I'm going to talk about like, what audit is, and audit, spoiler alert, audit may not be what you think it is. And then kind of like from our point of view, what the goal of an audit is. And kind of like, okay, what's the tip of reducing audit costs and enhancing audit like efficiency, efficacy. So the first thing is, I think when people think about the term audit, then this is oftentimes what's being like popped in their mind, like, oh, financial audit. And, they consider, they link these two terms together, but is it a correct notion? I would say no. And so there's a lot of text there, I know, but we're just going to look at the most important part. So this is kind of like the wiki definition of financial audit. And you can see one thing, the first line is like, oh, it's talking about a financial assessment of an entity as its whole, right? So an entity, and whether it's profit-oriented or not. The second line here is as required by law. That's another highlight I want to have here. Now, the third one here is, well, auditors do consider propositions before them, obtain evidence. This one we can talk about a little bit later. The last one is free from material misstatement, right? So this is kind of like the stuff you think when you're like thinking about like financial audits. Now let's look at it from the looks of web-free security audit. Still a lot of stuff, but let's just zoom in into parts of stuff. So here, instead of the whole entity, we see it's a part of project defined by the developers, right? And whether it's security, so from profit-oriented to security-oriented or not. So this part seems okay, right? So it's marked in green. But the kind of problem is like it's a part of project, not the whole project. That's number one. And secondly, it was defined by the developers, not someone else, right? The second point is the most different thing here. There is no law that is like requiring people to get audits, requiring them, and then like standardizing how to get an audit, right? So, and it's also kind of impractical. How would you have a law like determine how you're going to implement your code? That's very different from bookkeeping. Like bookkeeping is relatively simple activity, whereas, well, coding is a Turing-complete activity, and that is very complex, right? So that's why it's given a very complex name, Turing-complete. The third and fourth is sort of similar, and this is why the audit term is sort of still acceptable. So we auditors, web-free security audits, we do consider the propositions that comes before them, which we look at the user document that was, out-facing, and we verify whether those are correct or not. And this is kind of similar, like, oh, free from material misstatement, right? So these are kind of like similar, and that's where kind of the notion of audit works. But the notion of audit don't work is the one, like the point 1 and point 2. So this is one thing I want to point out, the impractical goal of a security audit. If you have this thing in mind, then that's not the correct notion. Like, oh, I'm hiring an expert or experts to ensure there's no bug. If you're a developer, you probably know this is very hard to achieve, almost impossible. So this is really the wrong mindset, and I always like want to take the opportunity to generalize this to the general public. What is actually the goal of a security audit? A lot of words. A couple things. One, audit itself is a time-limited activity, right? And what we're trying to do here is to assist the project, assist the developers into finding inconsistencies and vulnerabilities, these two things. And here, the last thing is what you defined of your protocol, right? So this is for the developers. Vulnerability and inconsistency, let me expand a little bit there. Vulnerabilities is like, hey, I have this design. I think it's awesome, it's innovative. And when auditors are looking at it, they say like, oh, this design has flaws because we can exploit it, kind of like the business logic, right? And you don't want this consequence. So that's vulnerabilities, in my opinion. Inconsistency is another big part of audits. So you say you wanted to do it one way, but your implementation is actually doing another thing. As an example, we have previously audited a protocol, options protocol, right? Some people may have background, but options, in simple terms, there are like two types of very different options. One is European option, another is American option. And they implemented European and not the American, but they intended to do American, right? Completely different. But they didn't realize that until we audited it. And this is inconsistencies, right? So it's different because it's not really vulnerable. It's inconsistent. Yeah. So this is the goal of a security audit. I kind of like to do this visual comparison with some other kind of certificates or stuff that we typically see. So the left one, the left one for you guys is the typical financial audit or bookkeeping kind of stuff. So you have the government and define the scope and define the rules of how you do this audit, right? And you have the test subject and demonstrate these relevant data. And then the auditor then comes in and examine these things, right? So this is how like financial audit work. Now on the right side, these are also two common other types of certificates. So the one above is, let's say like a TOEFL test or GRE test or any test, right? The examiner defines the scope and tells you like, hey, this is the scope. And then you like kind of like show them the data, your ability, and then they will examine, assess the output, right? So that's the upper right. The the down right one is another kind of like certificate. Sometimes we say like, oh, this entity has this credibility. And basically how it does is like, okay, the test subject, there's no external entity that defines the scope, but the test subject just publishes report, publishes data, and then there's like a independent examiner publishes a report based on whatever is published outside, right? But they themselves define and collect the data. So these are all very different, but very closer to our real life, kind of like certificate auditing experience. What audit is in Web3 space is this. The developer team defined the scope, okay? So this is completely different. The developer team defined the scope, and auditor accept the scope and assess only that scope, right? So of course there are a lot of like notions that comes out of this. A very simple one is, if I get an audit, does that mean that I'm secure or not? That's something that everyone wants to know, and the short answer is no. And I can translate it in the very simple terms. If I take a TOEFL test, does that mean that my English is great? No, right? Because I need to like see the assessment. That's one thing. Second, if I can define my own scope, then hey, TOEFL test, let's only test my writing ability. And I define the test, I define the scope, and I only take the test that way, and I get a good assessment. Does that mean that my English is great? Not necessarily, right? And so there are like these notions that comes out of this. So that's why we're going back. Security audit's real goal is to help developers, right? It is from the developer, for the developer, helping them to see what flaws there are in what they wanted to see. This is the current state of the audit industry in Web3. So the audit is not being enforced by government. There's no government involved here. The project is the one paying for it, requesting for it. And it's up to the project to publish the report or not, because, well, they pay for it, right? And the third thing is the main goal that I've been keep trying to convey. Audit firms is to present findings to improve dev team's code, okay? We do write as fairly as possible because we do know that these things can be used as marketing material from the dev team to the general public. And so we do write these things, not only having the dev team in mind, but also like, oh, if they publish this, what notion does it, like what kind of message does it convey? So we are sort of aware of this, and then we are careful about it. But the main goal is always to improve dev team's code. Now, I'm going to the third part, which is actually talking about how to reduce costs for your audits and how to improve the security. But before that, it's sort of necessary to understand what's the auditor's thought process. And this is sort of like roughly, okay? Let's see. So the green part, background knowledge, that is already inside the auditor's brain, right? There's no additional information. The purple part is documentation, comments, and code. This all comes from developer side, the project side. And these, of course, requires the input from the developer. Now, it all goes to a couple things. So auditors tries to do three things when they're kind of assessing a project. They want to understand your intention, the intention of the project. They want to understand the implementation, right? And also, like, just from their background knowledge, they know, like, oh, some of the past attack vectors or some of the common errors that they've seen, those kind of stuff. So they have this like list relevant attack vectors and threat modeling going on. So these are the three things they do in parallel. The ones I listed as kind of like painted as yellow means that it is affected by user or project's input, their documentation, their comments, their code quality. What we try to find after understanding this, there's like the understanding phase, then there's the attack phase, kind of. Basically, we ask very high level these questions. Does the intention make sense? Because if it doesn't, then, well, there's a vulnerability in your design. Secondly, are there discrepancies between the intention and implementation, right? And this is the inconsistency that I mentioned earlier. Well, the third thing is there's the common attack vectors, and then we just like check against them. This is more or less simple for us, but it's kind of like the learning curve, a lot of things. And all these things compile into findings. But as you can see, a lot of these are determined by or affected by user or the project's input, which is the documentation, comments, and code. Now, as you may have remembered, auditing itself is a time-limited fashion, right? So we think about how much time we need to understand this thing and then attack the thing. So the kind of trick to reduce your audit costs is also simple, actually, is to reduce the time that your auditors need to understand your project, as simple as that. So having higher code quality, documentation quality, better design pattern, coding style, test quality, code readability, and don't do over optimization, these will, make your project basically more readable, more understandable, reduce the time, right? Now, the great news is it is also a way to optimize for security because it's generally just more clear, right? I want to give example. It might seem ridiculous, but this does happen in the industry. So I've been scoping out a project, and all its variable naming or contract naming are human names, like contract Joseph, and then contract Jennifer. I'm like, okay, so Joseph.swap Jennifer, and I'm like, what? And so, like, just by reading that, you're like getting headaches, right? And this goes into this part, the purple part. Like, don't mess up your code. Don't do these things. This is the ridiculous side of things. Then there's it's a spectrum, right? So the other common misconception is like, if I write my code so well, you should be able to read my code and understand it. Unfortunately, no, that is not the case. There's different reasons for that. So we need to guess the intention. Like, we need to guess your intention and then read your implementation. And if you don't have a separate documentation or comments or all those kind of things, then we have to guess. We cannot, then there's no inconsistencies to be found. And we can only kind of like guess the inconsistencies. And that makes it harder. So generally, these things, I would say, can reduce your audit cost and also optimize for security. Because for the same time frame, we get to understand it deeper and then attack the protocol in like more creative ways because we understand it deeper. Now, audit itself is not the end of security. That's how we view it. And this is what I want to like, if you're gonna take away another message from this talk, this is the other thing. Like getting audit itself doesn't mean it's secure, right? And even if you're auditing the whole protocol, it still doesn't mean it's secure. Why? Because the EVM itself may change, right? There could be changes. Like one old example was that one of the gas, I think for S-load or S-store changed, and then it broke some of the contracts, like through the fallback function, right? And that's the EVM part that was changed. And so what you need to do actually, like for this, from the security firm's kind of like perspective, we consider this like a defense in depth. So there's a lot of layers. The ultimate goal is security of users' funds. And if that is our ultimate goal, then there are a lot of things that we can do. And some of the things are actually doable just from the developer side, which is developing using best practices, which we already talked about, which will reduce your costs and all that. You can also do automated scanning and testing. That's a good dev would do. And of course, security auditing is one thing. But after security auditing, there's monitoring and incident response. Because we don't know what we don't know, right? And EVM may change and all that. That's one thing. Then the last thing is if the unfortunate things happened in those events, you still want to prevent things from happening, at least prevent loss of funds for your user, then there's sort of like insurance, right? So this is how we see it. Like there is a lot of these layers that we can prevent and enhance our security, rather than like, oh, I got an audit, it's secure, perfect. No, this is how we see it. So also gonna quickly talk about the different audit types. So the one that people are more familiar about are code review audits. Basically, we review the code of the smart contract or the node software. We're also doing infrastructure audits. So basically looking, like right now there are like a lot of like these staking facilities, they run AWS, etc. How is their security posture, right? How are they managing their keys, etc. So this is infrastructure audits. There's deployment verification. So the code itself, although it may be secure by its implementation, its configuration may lead to vulnerabilities, right? I guess it's, okay, that's a little bit different, but I have an example, which is a contract is secure, but it should only be used with a token decimal of 18, right? There could be such a contract. And the team that we interacted, they didn't think about it, and then they linked it with, I think USDC was 8 or 6, right? It's just not 18, and then that messed up the decimals. So this is like where the deployment verification comes from, making sure that you actually configure everything right. Of course, there are like consulting engagements like before the code is mature. For insurance, monitoring, QuantStamp, because we're thinking this way, of course, we then offer such stuff. This is still like ongoing. Chainproof is a subsidiary of us. I think the interesting thing for me, at least, is that we are the first legal insurer in this space. I think it's under like some sort of legal framework and then reinsured by Munich Re. So Munich Re is the largest reinsurer in the world. Monitoring-wise, or let's say incidence response-wise, we're partnering with Hypernative. Hypernative is an awesome tool. I would recommend you guys to check it out. A lot of times, what they do, as a dev, I'm actually quite hyped. They have machine learning models, and when you deploy, or when an attacker deploy a malicious contract, they determine that, oh, it may be malicious, and then have an alert out, and then also determine the potential victims as well. And oftentimes that is like 5 minutes before the actual attack happened. So it's pretty cool. In theory, if we catch those and then pause it at that time, then we could have prevented a lot of the losses. But there are obviously like some, progress needs to be made on false positive, etc. But at least they have these things, and it has proven like detecting these attacks beforehand, before the actual attack happened. So pretty cool to see them doing that. Yeah, so that's the talk. So there's the contact of mine. Feel free to reach out to me. And yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Audit's always very important, giving people a sense of confidence. Any questions about audits? Please raise your hand. We'll pass you a microphone. Any questions you want to ask about, not financial audits, but rather protocol audits in Web3? Raise your hand. Speak now or forever hold your peace. All good? Or everybody's an expert in audits? Okay, maybe you can ask them a question and then, no, I'm kidding. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you very much, Martinet. Appreciate it.